Okay, so let's talk about this motley crew of people right here. These are your grant managers at RCO. This is our Recreation and Conservation Grants team. They will be your most important resource in helping you scope and complete a strong LPM application. Different grants managers are responsible for different areas of the state. So you can go to our contact a grants manager webpage to figure out who would be the correct point of contact for you, depending on where you're located. Your grant managers have a number of important roles throughout the grant process. This includes things like working with you to develop a strong eligible funding request, helping you prepare for implementation, monitoring project progress, and improving reimbursement requests, just to list a few. Especially given that this is a new program, we encourage you to actively utilize this important resource. Also, the key resources that you need to successfully navigate this new program can be found on our website. To navigate to the grant program page on the RCO website, you will want to click on Grants and then select LPM. This will pop up a list of LPM resources. On this page is where you will find a to-do list that will help you know what you need to do and in what order, the grant manual, which lays out all the important rules and requirements for funding, a couple of resources meant to help you assess whether a particular project is eligible for funding and how you can reduce risk and increase success, given that this source of money, i.e. this is operating dollars. And Nick will talk a little more about the significance of what operating versus capital means and the importance of the timeline of that money. And an applicant authorization template will be provided there, which is the only required attachment as part of the application. Now let's dive into a quick overview of the program so you know things like where the money came from, who is eligible to apply, and the timeline associated with the funding. Local Park Maintenance, or LPM, is a brand new grant program that has been funded in the 2023 to 2025 state operating budget. We were given a total of $5 million split across state fiscal year 2024 and state fiscal year 2025. The budget language that came with the funding limits funding to $100,000 total per organization. RCO does not know if there will be additional funding for this program in future years, but the agency has tried to build the policies and procedures required so that it can respond quickly and efficiently if similar funding is ever appropriated from the legislature in the future. Organizations eligible for LPM funding are cities, towns, counties, parks, and recreation districts, port and public facility districts, as well as Native American tribes. Each eligible entity may only submit one application to LPM. One keynote regarding eligibility is that projects may only be proposed for funding on land owned by an eligible entity. For example, a city would not be able to apply for funding to do maintenance on land owned by a school district or a nonprofit organization. The budget proviso, however, does allow for nonprofits to be a partner in helping support projects being implemented by an eligible entity. So a nonprofit may help prepare an application, it may manage funded projects, or even provide labor and materials to projects, but they are not eligible to apply for funding directly. The Local Parks Maintenance online application opened this morning, and the completed application is due on September 18th. Immediately after the application window closes, RCO staff will review projects for completeness and eligibility with a very limited window for applicants to provide clarification if any is needed. Beginning September 28th through October the 25th, the LPM Evaluation Committee will evaluate and score the projects. This evaluation and scoring process will result in a ranked list of projects for funding consideration. During the month of November, RCO staff will issue grant agreements to the successful applicants. I will now turn the time over to Nick to talk about project types and how to scope project proposals.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. As Dan said, my name is Nick Norton. I'm a policy and planning specialist here at RCO. And so I'm going to go through some of the meat and potatoes of the local parks maintenance program, really to help you scope a successful and eligible and complete application, specifically talking about kind of project types, eligible activities, eligible costs, and also some fiscal considerations based on the color of money that we were given. So interestingly, this is a relatively new, it's brand new program, excuse me, and we only fund one project type, and a very specific one. It's deferred maintenance. This is different than a project type that we funded in the local park space for a long time. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to make sure people have a general understanding of what we mean by deferred maintenance at RCO, and really what is and isn't deferred maintenance relative to some of the other programs you may have seen in our agency before. And specifically, some of the operative words when we're talking about deferred maintenance are around repairing or keeping up or upkeep or partial replacement of something that already exists. That's distinct from what we call here at the agency routine or operational maintenance. That's not eligible for funding in this program. That refers to things that you might do many times a year, and we'll go into some examples in the next slide. It's also development, renovation, or improvement projects are not eligible as well. And we'll go through, again, a few slides to help you try and understand or develop some muscle memory around how we define those and what those might look like on the ground at your park. I really want to put in a strong plug, and I see somebody put that in the Q&A already, that we created an eligible activities decision tool that you'll find on the website. And it's a really handy tool that you can use before you even talk with a grants manager to help you understand if the activity you're thinking about or the project you're looking at doing, if it actually fits our definition of deferred maintenance. And if so, it gives you even more specifics about what kind of pathway you might think about for an application based on the nature of the activity. So I really highly recommend reading that closely and running all your sort of priority deferred maintenance projects through that tool to see if they're truly eligible. So I'm going to give an example. I'm a huge soccer fan, so of course I'll pick a soccer field as sort of a template for this example. If you're looking to add a new soccer field to your park, RCO considers that to be a development project. So you're adding capacity and a new facility. That's not eligible here. I think that's probably fairly clear to most people. You may have your own internal definitions of maintenance or deferred maintenance, and our hope is that this aligns with that. Also, if you're looking at, for example, maybe adding lighting to extend, the hours of the day that you can use a soccer field, or if you're considering, you have a priority to convert a grass soccer field to a turf, or you're trying to replace an older turf, completely for a whole soccer field, all those things we consider to be renovation projects, and they are not eligible for this funding. By the same token, if you're going to be marking fields for game day or mowing, the grass got long and you're going to mow it for a kid's soccer game the next day, those are things you're doing regularly throughout the year, and those also are not eligible. They would be a form of routine or operational maintenance. So on the last column here are things that this program is actually meant to fund, and we would be really excited to fund. If your field has sort of deteriorated and is getting really weedy or has big patches of mud, reseeding that, if you have goals that have rusted or fallen down, repairing those goals or replacing them. And maybe you have a big, irrigation leak that's really causing problems with the quality of the play surface, and you need to get in and fix those. Those are great examples of a deferred maintenance project that we'd be really excited to see in an application, and that would be eligible for reimbursement. I'm going to give a second example related to a restroom. So if you were going to install a new vault toilet, that's something you have as a high priority locally. Again, that would be a development project here at RCO, and it would not be eligible for funding here. Again, similarly to the soccer example, if you were going to sort of add a new toilet on on the kind of footprint, or you were going to put outdoor lighting around that, so it could be more accessible during the night, or if it's the winter time and it gets dark at 4:30. Again, those we consider to be sort of improvement or renovation projects. and those are not eligible. Another example would be just cleaning the stalls, or perhaps, you have to pump out the tank every so often. Those are things, again, multiple times a year that we would consider to be a form of routine maintenance that's not eligible for funding. The kind of things on a restroom that, would be an eligible cost would be, if your roof is leaking. That's a great thing, fixing an old roof. Or if there's actually just the toilet inside is old, or it's fallen apart, or it's cracked, or whatever, replacing that would be, a feature, a component of the larger restroom. That would be a great thing to ask for funding. Or if you have a plumbing issue and you need to repair it, again, that's something that doesn't happen every year, and it's clearly a maintenance need, and it's not sort of expanding the capacity of the facility itself. So I'm hoping those gave you a better idea of the kinds of things that would be eligible for funding. And I wanted to make a quick note that we do allow in our policies in the manual small additions or retrofits if you need to help meet accessibility standards. We do consider those a form of deferred maintenance, because you're really coming up to an existing standard that you're trying to meet that existed prior. So that would be things like the handlebars in the bathroom, or curb grading, or things like that would also be eligible, even though they provide some sort of additionality to the facility. And again, I want to send you back to the decision tool, and maybe there's something that you're not quite sure. It feels like it's on the line, and you think it's deferred maintenance, but you're not sure. Again, your grant managers, we all have a system in place, where we can talk about it and get you a formal determination before you apply, so that you're applying with something that would be eligible for funding. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about, once you have your suite of things that are eligible and they're deferred maintenance under that umbrella, kind of different flavors of deferred maintenance activities. They're not all created equal. And specifically, in order to do that, I wanted to take a second to talk about cultural and historic resources. That's a critical piece of the work we do at RCO. Pursuant to the Governor's Executive Order 2102, every project that potentially could impact cultural or historic resources is something that we review. And it's a review that's coordinated by RCO, and may require, in a lot of situations, some sort of compliance actions or mitigation, like a survey or monitoring through the life of the project. So that's something we take really seriously, but at the same time, that work to establish cultural resource compliance and do that review, it does take time and capacity on our end. And sometimes, it requires, in all likelihood, it requires some amount of funding from your grant and capacity on your end. So because this money has a very short timeline, and we'll get into that a little bit later, we've actually crafted different pathways for how you might scope an application based on whether your deferred maintenance activity would trigger a more intensive cultural resource review. So it's a novel approach designed to hopefully get as much money out there as possible in a short time based on your local needs. So more specifically, we have two kind of tiers of activities that are fundable, and they come with different strings attached. So your tier 1 activities are those that wouldn't involve ground disturbing actions, and they don't involve work on structures older than 50 years. And again, those are basically the conditions where, our cultural resource review is much quicker and really wouldn't involve, costly compliance actions or time on our end or your end. So those tier 1 activities, if you are including those, deferred maintenance that are classified as tier 1, you can have those in both of the application types we have available. And again, I'll talk about that in the next slide. And generally speaking, you can spend the money as soon as the grant agreement is signed, that you're able to go and implement very quickly after after that money is available through a grant agreement. However, if you're also potentially looking at something that we might call a tier 2 activity, these are activities that do involve, below ground or ground disturbing work. Think regrading of a pathway, or digging holes to replace a fence post, or, again, we mentioned sort of replacing irrigation. That's going to involve subsurface components. Or it may involve work on a structure. Let's say you have a pool bathhouse that's, 60 years old. Those things would require, a cultural resource review and potentially money associated with them to, monitor or do a cultural resource survey. So what happens is if those activities are being proposed, it means they can really only be proposed as part of what we call a single site or tier 2 application. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. And money for actually implementing those activities is only available in the second fiscal year. So after July 1 of 2024, next year. That would give you, 1 year to spend and implement those kind of activities. And that allows us the time and you the time on the front end to establish compliance, and we can do our review. And if there's a survey needed, we can accomplish that and then make sure that, if you're good to go when you get the green light, then you can start in July 1. So there's some different flavors here. And based on how you decide to propose tier 1 and tier 2 activities, it has implications for the kind of application that you might submit. So this is sort of a stylized example, but I want to walk through this because I think this is somewhat different than other programs that we have. So I really want to make sure that we're spending the time to kind of talk through the logic here. So I expect that many of you might have a situation like this. You have, let's say, 4 park sites. Again, some of you may have a lot more, some of you may only have a couple, but you've got a number of priority deferred maintenance things that they're on your list. Some of them, maybe you're replacing old rusty signs, or you have a bridge where a few boards are rotten, or you want to replace a backstop on your on your dugout, things like that that are above ground and aren't on an older structure, and those would be tier 1. By the same token, it's very likely you have a lot of other priority deferred maintenance needs that may be tier 2, those sort of orange dots on the slide there, where you may be replacing irrigation, or you do have that older bathhouse that's really one of your highest priority needs. So that's going to be a typical situation for you. And you have essentially 2 pathways that you're going to have to figure out how you want to scope and submit your application relative to those activities. And that would be, your 2 options essentially are what we call a multi-site or tier 1 application, or a single site or a / tier 2 application. And so the multi-site one would be an example of if you said, okay, it's important that we can implement this, soon. And we really have high priority needs at multiple places across our service area. We have 4 different sites, all of which have things that we want to accomplish. So if you can scope out those tier 2 activities, then you're eligible to submit a multi-site or tier 1 application. So those are defined by not needing that sort of extensive cultural resource review and compliance. So you're proposing only above ground activities that aren't on older structures. In that case, we're not putting a minimum or maximum on the number of park sites where you can propose work. So if you submit a multi-site or tier 1 application, you could do it at 1 park, you could do it at 4, you could do it at 10. It's really, for us, we want you to just be able to meet your needs as long as it's above ground and not on an older structure. And generally speaking, there's a number of benefits where, because how the money is available and the nature of these types of activities, they tend to require, maybe less contracting or permitting, that there's less unpredictability. So generally speaking, we would recommend utilizing and scoping and submitting a multi-site application if possible. We know that's not always the case, and we wanted to provide an alternate option if you need to go below ground, for example. But we do recommend this to the extent it's possible given your local priorities. Your other option would be to say, oh man, we have our flagship park and most of our deferred maintenance needs are here. That includes a couple of below ground things that are pretty obviously tier 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and do the stuff at our other parks, with our local funds, and then we're going to focus our application on this 1 site, which would allow us to do below ground work. So you could submit a single site / tier 2 application that would be defined by the presence of a tier 2 activity that requires cultural resource review and compliance. And again, in order to allow us to do the review and not take up too much of your grant funding through cultural resource compliance, it would be limited to 1 park site. Again, you can have those above ground activities there, but if you have 1 tier 2 activity you're proposing, it immediately shrinks the potential scope to a single site project. So I hope that's clear. Again, if you have questions about that, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll try and get to those at the end. And again, grant managers are a great resource to help you work through that because this is a slightly different setup than we've ever had before. And then a quick note, once you've identified those deferred maintenance activities that are eligible, and you've scoped your application such that whether you're submitting a multi-site or a single site application, there are a number of eligible costs that we allow to help support you getting that work done. That includes equipment purchase, rental and repair, contract services, salaries and benefits, liability insurance if you have volunteers to help do the work, materials and supplies, transportation, permitting costs, up to 5% of your request can be for just the general administration of the project, submitting billings and coordinating things, that type of thing. And then if you are going to submit a single site, we certainly want to encourage you to include some funding for a likely cultural resource review on the front end in order to make sure that we can do that, and you budget for that. So that would certainly be an eligible cost as well. And lastly, before I turn it back to Dan, I wanted to provide some fiscal considerations, because the color of money, as Dan alluded to earlier, is very different. And that has really strong implications for how we have to manage a project and how you might want to scope a project and whether this funding is a good fit for you. And specifically, we receive this money as operating dollars. So they're unique. For those of you who maybe have worked with RCO and applied to grants in the past, it's likely you got capital funding, which is kind of a different ball of wax. And so specifically, operating dollars have a much shorter window, and they have some restrictions, strong restrictions about what you can spend in the first fiscal year and the second of a state biennium. And so what that means for you as a sponsor, and a sponsor is someone, an applicant who received funding and is actually starting to implement a project, we can't allow extensions. All the projects end at June 30th, 2025. No cost increases, no carryover between state fiscal years, and we're going to ask that people bill quarterly through the project period so that we can ensure that funds are being spent according to plan. So if you're funded, you'll work with your grant manager to create a budget and a spending plan. I would assume any money over or under overspent in each fiscal year cannot be recouped. I really want to emphasize that. So it's important that if you do receive an award, that you're very thoughtful and about how you budget and work on your spending plan. And again, we have a guidance document that walks through how this color of money is different, that I hope will be really helpful in kind of giving you a sense of the constraints and how you might be effective in kind of reducing risk and uncertainties in what you're proposing and how you propose to spend the money. So I highly encourage you to go to our operating budget guidance document. And I'm going to turn it back to Dan, and he can talk a little bit about actually the nuts and bolts of how to apply to LPM.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that. Yeah, now we'll talk about how to apply an RCO's online application system. And this is a system called Prism. You can access Prism from our website. Go to the Prism page and click on Prism Online. If you do not have a Prism account, then on the right are the steps that you will need to go through to establish one, which involves both creating a new Prism account, establishing a Secure Access Washington or SAW account, adding Prism Online as a SAW service, and then completing a one-time double sign-on. The next time you log in, it will only require a single sign-on. We have a web page dedicated to helping people establish and manage their Prism accounts, which is linked above. Prism Online works best using the following internet browsers: Edge, Chrome, Firefox, or Safari. And just as a note, Explorer is not recommended. Once Prism Online is added to your SAW account, from there you will be able to enter Prism. To start a new grant application, click on the orange box on the top left that says New Application. The next page that will open asks you information about your organization, your program, and your project name. Depending on what type of application you have decided to submit, you will choose either Local Parks Maintenance Multi-Site Tier 1 or Local Parks Maintenance Single Site Tier 2. Once your application has been started, this is what it will look like. I want to point out the application navigation tree on the left. This shows that a lot of information is needed to complete an application, so it is important to start early. You can also use this feature to go between pages within the application. The next button will auto-save each time it is clicked. This function will allow you to exit and come back to your application at any time without losing data. We have specifically designed LPM to be a fairly simple application process that minimizes the amount of time needed to complete. Specifically, the bulk of the application involves answering 3 questions, which involve mainly a general description of the project, describing the project's impact, and accurately communicating the applicant's readiness to proceed with the project. If you are submitting a single site Tier 2 application, then you will have to answer some additional questions related to cultural resources so that we can perform a review of the project and determine what compliance steps must be done prior to any ground disturbing activities. There is also a section about metrics where you will check boxes based on key pieces of your application and provide the amount you are requesting for key line items, such as equipment, maintenance work, permits, cultural resources, project administration, etc. There's only one attachment that is required for LPM, the application authorization and electronic signature form. This needs to be something that is formally adopted and signed by your organization that gives you authority to apply for a grant. This means it needs to be approved by your council, commission, or board. I know for some entities this process can take a little while, so again, start early. This can be signed by a staff member if they have the standing delegated authority to authorize grant submissions and sign contracts on behalf of your agency, tribe, or organization. I want to end this section with a few tips that can possibly help you submit a successful LPM application. Please take note of the tips in the boxes on this slide. In particular, since this is a new program, we really encourage you to read the manual and resources in detail and reach out early to your grants manager if you have questions. Because this program funds a novel project type and has a source of money with more specific rules and constraints, it is important that you are particularly thoughtful in how you scope a project, such that you can spend the money in a predictable way and in a timely manner. I'll now turn the time back over to Nick to talk about the project review, evaluation, funding, and implementation process.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to take us home here. And so we'll talk about really everything that happens after you submit your application in mid-September. And specifically what's going to happen after, I believe it's September 18th is when those are due. RCO staff will have a period during September 18th through the 27th, where we're going to review the application specifically for eligibility, ensuring that the entity is eligible to apply and that all the proposed activities are eligible and appropriate for the application option you chose, and that everything is complete during that window. And again, during that time, staff may request clarification from the applicant on smaller minor pieces related to costs or budget, and those need to be addressed within 48 hours. I want to be really clear, there's not an opportunity to go back and forth and have a substantive conversation with your grants manager to address any fundamental eligibility issues or sort of improve your application substantively after the initial submission. This is really about clarifications relative to costs or completeness. So that's a time for you to be really ready to respond. And I think this puts a premium on the doing work to accurately scope your project and talk to your grant manager to make sure that we don't have any issues during this technical review period. And after that, all of the eligible and complete projects are going to go into a hopper where they're evaluated based on 4 different criteria. 2 of these criteria are subjective criteria. That is, they relate to review by a team, an evaluation team of volunteers who possess a statewide perspective and are recognized for their experience and knowledge of local parks and recreation. Specifically, they'll be scoring questions, the 2 questions in the application related to the priority and the impact of the proposed maintenance activities locally. and the ability of the applicant to complete activities within the biennia. We also will be scoring projects based on 2 objective criteria. So those things, kind of indices or information that we have available that's quantitative. And specifically, 0 to 10 points will come based on the social vulnerability index of the jurisdiction or site. That is a powerful index of different kind of demographic and economic information about a service area or a census tract. And so we'll be using those to score projects in both application types, as well as the local low income. That would be the median household income of the census tract relative to the county or the state. It would depend on who's applying, how we compare it, and how we score that. And all of the more information about how we apply these and the specific questions that you'll be answering that relate to how we evaluate these can be found in the grant manual towards the end. We have a pretty detailed section on evaluation. And then once we have all those scores, so staff are going to combine all those different scores for the evaluation criteria, both those subjective ones from the evaluation team and those objective ones that relate to your census tract data, and determine the total scores. And I want to be clear, and I put it over on the left of this slide, that we'll actually be ranking the different application types separately. So for those of you who are submitting a multi-site application, tier 1 application, those would all be ranked together. If you're submitting a single site / tier 2 application, those would be ranked together. And specifically, we wanted to reduce, it can be difficult to compare those. And so we wanted to have them in the same basis. And then what we'll do is, based on those scores, each application type will be funded the same percentage, up to $5 million, which is what we have available. So as you can see here in this scenario, more people submitted multi-site projects, but your percentage of the projects that receive funding is the same as a single site. So there's not an advantage or disadvantage to having one, to scoping it in a particular way for ranking purposes. And then those rank lists serve as the basis for the funding decisions that are made by the RCO director at the end of October. And I want to talk a little bit about project implementation as well. So this would be the stage after you rank and you're awarded funding provisionally, and our director says, yes, I like this rank list, and you're on that list. What happens next? So prior to actually doing the work on the ground, there are 2 pieces between when you receive a funding award and then when the money starts to flow and you can do the work. One is the development of a spending plan with RCO staff. So during the application, in order to keep it fairly simple, we've asked for some sort of high-level budget estimates for key line item expenditures. But at this point, we're going to work with you hand in hand to develop a spending plan. And specifically, this would be laying out, what your expenses would be for each state fiscal year. So, for the fiscal year that ends in June 30th of 2024, and then also for the fiscal year that would go from July 1, 2024 to June 30th, 2025. And then also laying out those expenses relative to their status as a tier 1 and tier 2 activities. Again, as you may recall, those have different strings attached to them, and the money starts to flow at different times. So, we'll need to make sure that your budget incorporates those things so that we can, follow the operating budget constraints and make sure that, we're not leaving any money on the table for you and you get it all spent and on the ground. So once you have that spending plan developed, then, the next piece is the real big one. This is the important one, is you sign a project agreement together with your grant manager. And this is the most important document, of this whole process. It's the legal contract between your organization and the state of Washington for the funding. And it contains a number of different pieces, sort of some standard terms and conditions. It talks about your specific scope of work and the period of performance to get it done. It lays out the amount of grant funding, as well as reporting requirements and any long-term obligations. And specifically in this program, the only long-term obligations that we would have relate to the purchase of equipment. And again, you'll find those equipment policies in the grant manual itself. And there is a sample project agreement on our website that you can certainly review, and it will look very similar to something like that. And this project agreement is also referenced in the authorization or resolution that you will submit as the one attachment in your application. So once you do all that, and you've got awarded funding, you've got your spending plan, you signed your grant agreement, ideally by the end of November, our estimate is that you actually ready to go and you're off and running. And so for the first state fiscal year from November, that's another 7 months. During that time, which ends June 30th of 2024, you're doing your work to implement those tier 1 activities, those things that are above ground, and those things that aren't on an older structure. And you're also working to, perhaps depending on what happens with RCO's review, there's going to be steps and money that you're utilizing to establish culture resource compliance for those below ground activities that you're looking to start if you're doing a single site application. So the idea is you're doing your prep work there such that you've achieved culture resource compliance for the next state fiscal year, and you can get those projects done. So for the second state fiscal year, that goes from July 1 of 2024 to June 30th of 2025, that's the point at which you're, depending on the project, the application option and the way you scoped your project, you'd be implementing both of those tiers of activities in accordance with your spending plan. And again, a reminder that, you'd be completing projects by June 30th of 2025. And if we don't complete them by then, all the money's gone. It's operating. So there are no extensions. So that's kind of the line in the sand. So that's all the information that Dan and I wanted to provide to you. So I see that we have almost 53 things in the question and answer. So what we're going to do is go ahead and take those from top to bottom in the time that we have left. If you feel like you've gotten the answers that you need, feel free to hop off. But we'll take probably about, I would say, 10 minutes or so running through those. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on those questions. If you have a very site-specific question that deals with, well, here's my situation locally. Is this a tier 1 or tier 2? Those questions are going to be great to talk to your grant manager about. I may pull 1 or 2 of them out if they're, something we can illustrate a concept that would be helpful for everybody. But otherwise, I'll stick to more of the general questions associated with the information we provided today. So one of the first ones I see is from Deborah about, will the application questions for both tier 1 and tier 2 projects be made available before a city chooses to open and submit an application? It's a great question. As I mentioned, all of the we kind of walked through what there's sort of a short answer questions, and there's one describing the project, and there's one related to need and impact, and then there's another one that's related to readiness to proceed. You'll actually find those full questions and guidance for how you might answer those in the grant manual in the evaluation section where we talk about our evaluation criteria. So those show up there, and that would be they're exactly the same as how you're going to find them in the PRISM application. So hopefully that allows you to move forward and to scope and consider a project, whether you even want to open an application and go forward. Tina asked a question about, would a boat launch be eligible for funding? And I want to make clear, I didn't mention it specifically in the presentation, but over water work, often because of the permitting and the time constraints on this funding, is not eligible for funding. So that's a good example of a specific question that I think is good for everybody to know. And there's another question about if there is a park and recreation service area that's larger than the city but includes the city, could the city apply for one grant and the Parks and Recreation District apply for another? That's a really good question. So absolutely. So if you have a Park and Recreation District that overlaps your city, you're both certainly eligible to submit one application each. However, we don't allow for you to submit an overlapping scope of work. So you can certainly, propose things that might strategically dovetail with each other. But if you're essentially proposing a $200,000 project, that wouldn't be eligible. So I hope that answers that question. And we have a question about, is a single Washington State park an eligible entity? And the budget proviso specifically limited the funding to go to local parks agencies. And so that's where we have cities, counties, and towns and parks and recreation districts. So a state park entity or a state agency isn't eligible to apply. And then we have another really good question about how you consider equipment to be deferred. And the equipment piece of this is actually a little bit different, and it's a really good question. So you can purchase new equipment. It doesn't have to be replacing an old piece of equipment. If the equipment itself is supporting your maintenance and construction work ongoing, and it's wholly devoted to that maintenance work in your jurisdiction, in your service area. So the equipment itself doesn't necessarily have to be replacing something that's old. We've already had some requests with people who have 25, 30-year-old trucks that do need to be replaced. That's great too. But the equipment itself can be new equipment that's additional, as long as it's supporting your maintenance program. And you'll find in our grant manual that we have some conditions. There's sort of 3 bullets around establishing whether equipment would be an eligible cost. And so I encourage you to look at those and make sure that your proposal, even if it's a new piece of equipment that's not replacing something, meets those requirements. And you can certainly reach out to your grant manager. Certain equipment that's over $5,000 would actually require pre-approval by RCO. We've already been seeing some of those come in about, oh man, I want to get a truck, and here's why it meets the criteria that you've laid out. Can I get approval? And a grant manager will go through that and say, yeah, I think it does. Here's your pre-approval from RCO. Just have that handy when you submit your application. And I'm seeing a lot of questions about, site-specific questions, and I'm going to take those, and I'm thinking what I can do is try and answer those. We can have those written up somewhere. We could even put them on the website or something like that. I see one about something like resurfacing a tennis court. I think that one might actually be something I'll try and answer right now, because I think it helps everyone for decision-making purposes. So I think we explicitly stated in the grant manual policies that something like if you have a tennis court or a basketball court or some surface that maybe, the lines have deteriorated or worn or it's cracked or something like that, resurfacing that, provided it's not actually changing the fundamental grade and you're not exposing earth and turning the earth, that's totally a great deferred maintenance activity that would be tier 1, because it would be above ground. You're just, repainting the lines or resurfacing it with something that, that maybe gives it an extra life. And I'm going down. I'm seeing a couple questions about people who want, I think, as I'm interpreting them, who want to apply. They only have one park site where they want to do work, and all their activities are tier 1. So that's a great question. So I want to be very clear that as long as you're only doing those above ground activities that don't involve work on an older structure as well, and they don't disturb the ground, we made the name multi-site / tier 1 in hopes that you would see yourself in that. So yes, if you only have one park site and you're only doing tier 1 activities, you can apply in the multi-site / tier 1 category. So I want to make that very clear that you are eligible to go there such that you would receive the money earlier, and you wouldn't be, you wouldn't have to do those culture resource budgeting and compliance work on the front end. So yes, if you only are going to do it at one site because you only have one park, or that you only have one park that needs to do work, as long as you're scoping out those tier 2 activities, you can absolutely apply in the multi-site / tier 1 category. I see a question about, does a deferred equipment application stand on its own, or does the equipment have to be part of an activity / project applied for? So no, your equipment would be part of a larger application where you may be proposing multiple activities. And the equipment itself, obviously, I think it helps the application if the equipment, like for example, a big piece of equipment is supporting a specific activity you're doing, but it doesn't inherently have to. So you could be requesting funding to buy a truck to support your deferred maintenance program, and then be in the same application, be requesting money to do work that doesn't inherently, that may involve a different piece of equipment. So they're bundled together for the purposes of an application. And I'll go ahead and answer a few more. So I'll do 2 or 3 more, and then I'm going to take all these questions because they're really great, and do our best to try and have some answers to them that we can put onto the website. And then again, any other questions you have, we can go to your grant manager. So I see a question about would applying for equipment be a tier 1 application? And if all you're proposing to do is purchase equipment, yes, it would be a multi-site or tier 1 application, because that wouldn't invoke the cultural resource pathway that we talked about. Another great question about, can a consultant fill out an application for the agency, or can the agency add a consultant into PRISM to assist with the application? I'm going to try my best, and Dan might be able to help me on this one, but we do have an avenue where, if you are the eligible entity, you can fill out an application or start a PRISM application, and you can add a contact that would represent, your consultant or, an engineer, whoever it is that's going to support you, maybe just any other partner. And if that partner has a PRISM account, they're automatically given the opportunity to help support and fill out that PRISM application. So they become tied together such that, yes, you absolutely can have, if you are a smaller town, for example, and you have a firm that's going to help you do that, that's how you would set it up. As long as they have an account and they're linked to the application, they can support filling that out.
Correct. And the only thing I would simplify on that is the actual project contact that we have listed for the project representing the entity that's eligible to apply, they have to remain as the main point of contact. The others will have to be identified as either a consultant or an alternative project contact, but they can't be the project contact. That has to be a person that actually is working and employed by the agency that's eligible to be doing the project. That's how we like to see it.
Thanks, Dan. A couple about entity eligibility. I'll hit those. It's our school district properties eligible. They are not. So school districts aren't eligible for this funding. And then there's one about, is a not-for-profit HOA eligible for this grant? No, they wouldn't be eligible for this grant. Yeah, I need to be authorized by council to apply for grants, as I'm new in my position. Can I begin the application process and submit once I have the final authorization? Absolutely. Yeah, you can put your whole application together, and then once you have that piece, you just attach it in and then submit prior to the deadline. So absolutely, yeah, we certainly hope. The idea is in fact, we encourage everybody to go in there as soon as possible and see the scope of it, and kind of, now that you have a sense of how to scope it, and you have some more information from us today, our hope is that you go in and begin that as soon as possible, and you can attach that at any time prior to the deadline. There's a bunch of really, really great questions in here, and a lot of them are very site specific. So I'm going to answer maybe 1 or 2 more. And I see a question about, can an agency apply for more than one grant? So again, we said it in here, but I just want to reiterate that each specific organization can only apply to one grant. And I know there are some bigger organizations out there. Let's say, like you're a city that has kind of multiple, you have like a parks department, you have a public works department, you may have a sort of natural resource department. Regardless of how you're structured, any of those subdivisions, they're all counted under that umbrella. So really for, again, the city of Seattle would be the extreme example. They would be limited to a single application in the same way that it would be if you were the city of Colfax, for example, in Whitney County. Okay, I'm not seeing any other projects as I'm scrolling through that are kind of general projects that would be additive for everybody on the call. So I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up here. I'm going to take all these and come back with our team and try and do our best to get some answers on those and be ready for them. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining the webinar. Again, if you have questions, please reach out to your grant manager. They're going to be a huge source of support for this. A lot of these kind of questions I'm seeing in the chat are going to be relevant and right within their wheelhouse to help you get a determination on. So again, reach out. I hope this was helpful to everybody. Thank you so much, and good luck with the application, and take care.